Buchholz Plant Introductions, Part 18. Today I'll discuss various conifer introductions, some recent and others from time immemorial. The common denominator is that I didn't get rich from any of them, but I had a little bit of fun with their discovery. I'm often asked if I have a favorite conifer, and the question always gives me pause. I want to impulsively reply, Abbeys, the true firs, or I might reply ginkgo, but then that would confuse most questioners who don't understand why the broadleaf deciduous tree is technically considered a conifer. Ultimately, though, if I have any girlfriend of the forest, it must be Tsuga mertensiana, the western mountain hemlock. And just an hour's drive from my home, I can be up at elevation amongst the slender sylphs in the cool, thin air. The mountains of the world are where I'm most happy, regardless the continent, but veritable heaven on earth is located in the Cascade Range of western North America. On the flanks of Mount Hood, at about 4,000 to 5,000 foot elevation, one encounters large families of hemlocks, sometimes hundreds of members where the soil is to their liking, but nary a one where the conditions are not suitable. Unlike the gardener, the trees in nature get to choose. The Cascade Range extends for about 700 miles, from southern British Columbia to northern California. Prominent volcanoes include Mount Baker, Mount St. Helens, Mount Rainier, and Mount Adams, all in Washington state, Mount Hood in Oregon, and Mount Shasta in California. A good friend and great plant mentor was Dr. Bump of Forest Grove, Oregon. I would visit his large garden once a month, and he mine, and we would both discover treasures that were new to us. Usually left each other to wander alone, but once I remember encountering a 10-foot mountain hemlock with exceedingly blue foliage, and I hurried back to his house to ask about it. He reported that he dug it himself about 20 years previous from the shallow, rocky soil of Mount Hood, and he was proud indeed that it actually survived. His harvest was illegal, of course, from a national forest, but many plantsmen, such as he and I, answer to a higher authority than the government. Dr. Bump was delighted that I asked for scions, and years later, when I was able to sell the first crop, about 1992, I introduced it as Bump's Blue. My 35-year-old specimen that graces the waterfall section at the nursery is from the initial propagation, while the original tree itself continues in the late doctor's Garden of Wonders. How apropos that Dr. Bump's first name was Forrest. Certainly a name this plantman covets. And I remember one time when someone didn't quite catch his last name, he replied, Bump, like a bump on a log. In about 1998, I purchased 3-year bare root seedlings of Tsuga mertensiana. 1 year later, while preparing them as understock for grafting, I noticed a seedling with proportions of cream white, and I never seen another variegated form before or since. The Royal Horticultural Society's Encyclopedia of Conifers is accurate to describe the color as white in a shady location and light yellow if grown in full sun. I watched the seedling for a number of years, then named it Mountain Light when I decided to propagate. I concede that it's a wimpy little mutant that would only appeal to a curious conifer collector, especially since the Tsuga mertensiana species is not suitable for most American gardens anyways. I began a nursery in 1970, a full decade before I founded Buchholz Nursery. It wasn't a commercial undertaking at all, just a collection of various conifers that I planted on an empty lot behind my parents' house in Forest Grove, Oregon. So I established my own little grove in the grove, like I was destined to collect trees from the beginning. I purchased bare root seedlings from a real nursery located in the Cascade foothills above Silverton, Oregon, and the proprietor allowed me to trial 3 of this and 3 of that. One purpose was to clear up my ignorance about the difference between the genera Sequoia and Sequoia dendron, as most amateurs, like me then, assumed they were synonymous. I drove up to the mountains on a Sunday morning to pick up the goods, and the nurseryman agreed to leave my package at the edge of his driveway since he would be absent. A three-legged male dog hobbled out to greet me. After sniffing his visitor, he proceeded to piss on the package, which he accomplished without raising a leg. I wanted to kick the mutt, which he sensed, but he hurried off to avoid me. I returned 12 years later because I wished to wander the grounds, for there were a lot of mature conifers, and I was anxious to learn about them. I never did meet the original nurseryman, but his son allowed me to visit. He was rather ignorant, a university professor from California, and he announced that he would soon be selling the property. I was smitten with a collection of mountain hemlocks, whose blue needles glistened in the gloomy fog. I estimated the trees to be about 25 years old, and each one had a unique personality that appealed to me. I inquired if I could purchase a dozen of them, and I offered $35 apiece, with me digging and loading the lot. The professor agreed and even offered to use his own tractor to lift them onto my rental truck. I had my own property by then, the beginning of Buchholz Nursery, and I was quite pleased that I could plant out something mature on my otherwise empty property. Thus was established the Blue Forest section, and some of the Sugas still hover the grounds at about 65 years of age. One of the Suga martensianus that most impressed me was notable for its slender profile that featured drooping branches with terminal tips arching downward. I likened the tree to a ballerina, and as an avid aficionado of the art form, I named the beauty Blue Dancer. I didn't invent that dancer concept. Rather, I copied it from the elegant prose of the famous naturalist Donald Culrose Patai, 1898 to 1964, in A Natural History of Western Trees. He wrote that a young mountain hemlock is all feminine grace, long and slender. The arms are held out like a dancer's, and the smaller branches curve gracefully out and away and down, like the fingers of a hand extended but relaxed. My harem has been reduced over the years due to crowding and old age, but the remaining appear healthy and happy. Sadly, Blue Dancer herself succumbed in our hellish heat dome of 2021, when temperatures rose to 116 degrees Fahrenheit and higher in certain locations. Though totally scorched, I knew that she still had some life in her, but she pleaded to be put out of her misery since she could no longer perform. In tribute, I planted a younger Blue Dancer in her stead because the show must go on. Other mountain hemlock introductions include Blue Spire and Bonnie Blue from the late 1990s, but neither remain at the nursery anymore. I don't remember what happened to them, and I regret their absence, so I plead for a return if any Flora Wonder blog reader is in possession. The final Suga mertensiana that I'll discuss is Powder Blue, a seedling selection from about 1998. The RHS Encyclopedia claims that it originated in 1982 by Buchholz and Buchholz Nursery in Oregon, USA. But their timing is way off for sure. The term powder blue is commonly used in the trade to describe shiner, Colorado blue spruces with glamorous foliage. The glauco word is from Greek, glaukos, meaning gleaming or silvery, and doesn't refer to blue, although most nurserymen think of it that way. Powder means dusting, as in my blue hemlock being dusted with glimmerous silver cast. I was annoyed when another conifer, Sequoiadendron giganteum, powder blue, was introduced from Washington State a few years after my hemlock, but one should excuse the redwood name, for he was unaware that my powder blue had already been established. I collected a thread branch form of the western red cedar, Thuja plicata, Phyllophera nana, at the beginning of my career. Prior to that, about 1980, I saw it growing at the University of British Columbia Botanical Garden. A large, low sprawling mop of green, but the UBC tour guide mistakenly referred to it as a Thuja occidentalis. I tried to find a label but couldn't locate it, for I was positive that the specimen was Thuja plicata. So be it. I produced the old European cultivar by hardwood cuttings in winter, while sometimes we top graft on 3 to 4 inch standards. But it never was very popular. That it had a poor trade name is probably why. Eventually, a doppelganger entered the market that was called whipcord, and it originated as a seedling from Drake's Crossing Nursery, located east and above Silverton, Oregon, not far from the Suga Retenziana Nursery I mentioned earlier. The original whipcord is large and ugly now, or so I thought when I last saw it about 10 years ago, but it makes for a wonderful container plant at a smaller size, and Buchholz Nursery has sold a few thousand over the past decade. Whipcord is hardy to USDA Zone 5, and it is problem-free in my experience. But the most important lesson here is that a catchy name is very important in the nursery industry. In about 2014, I noticed some variegated twigs on one Thuja plicata whipcord that were colored cream white. Sometimes the entire thread is variegated, but better yet are the ones that are half and half. I have grafted some onto Thuja plicata rootstock in recent years, and now I am trialing to determine if the mutation will be stable. I have already given one away to Jason Hupp, the grandson of the Drake's Crossing owner, so from that perspective, it has been introduced. It is temporarily named whipcord variegated, but I should come up with a better name soon, before any more leave Buchholz Nursery. I'm fully aware that my discovery will likely prove to be a failure as a viable cultivar, but maybe not, though it serves as an example for how new plants come to exist. I was touring the Mount Hood area in about 2010 with Daniel Luscombe of the Bedgery Pinetum, the English arboretum with the largest collection of conifers in the world. On our descent from the Timberline Lodge, we proceeded east, then north to make a loop around Hood, and finally travel west down the world-famous Columbia River Gorge. We were 2 conifer lovers, with he the expert, and the Flora is unsurpassed for its coniferous species. A few miles below Timberline, Daniel blurted out that he had spotted a variegated pine located about 10 foot above the highway, a route taken by at least 1,000 vehicles per day. I made a U-turn to check it out, and then he began to apologize in case he was wrong. Happily for both of us, we really didn't encounter his pot of gold, and Daniel scampered up the bank to more closely inspect. Later that winter I returned, and in the snow I harvested a dozen scions, but leaving some variegated shoots intact. I was quick to cut, since I wasn't sure about the status of the protected land. The species was Pinus contorta, variant latifolia, and I called the discovery Mount Hood variegated, a rather poor name actually. While the original tree was growing in full sun at about 5,000 foot elevation with beautiful, clean color without scorch. Back at the nursery, some of the white needles burned when we reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Hoping that it would fare better in more benign climates, I sold all except one tree. But I can't report on how the others are performing. It is no longer in production at this time, but I haven't written it off completely either. In Conifers, the Illustrated Encyclopedia by D.M. Van Gelderen and J.R.P. Van Hoey Smith, is the introduction of Thuja platycladus orientalis loco green. Unfortunately, it is misidentified as Lisa, but it was never so designated. When visiting one summer, Van Hoey Smith noticed it in the garden. A plastic label is at the base of the tree with the Lisa name and rooting hormone rate, but that name referred to the propagator, while the metal label on the other side correctly said loco green. It is described as a dense, cylindrical plant, but strangely with greenish yellow foliage, turning yellow in spring. Actually, the foliage is medium green, per Van Hoey Smith's photo in summer, but with light green new growth in spring. Loco green looks similar to the old Euro cultivar Anthrotaxoides, or so thought Van Hoey Smith. While the latter is said to be difficult to propagate and hence rare, loco green is rather easy to propagate, at least for me, but the difficult suggestion rings true when this grower attempts to sell his propagules. A twig mutation developed on Thuja occidentalis loco green, which was bright yellow in color, and I predicted it would be a cheerful, worthy cultivar, and I named it Loco Gold. It too stuck easily from rooted cuttings, but unfortunately it looked rather drab when grown in full sun, kind of like a nutritionally challenged Loco Green. Nothing is worse than a conifer that is only sort of gold, and while a couple are still in the collection, we no longer have it in production. The Loco Green, Loco Gold tree in the photo above is no longer with me either, as it flopped apart and broke in a snowstorm and I dumped it. So if anything remains of the selection, you have the green version, not me. To conclude, Loco Green is gone, Loco Gold is no good, and Lisa, also my ex-wife's name, is invalid. Buchholz Nursery has propagated thousands, certainly over 100,000 cuttings of Thuja occidentalis, smaragd, over the years. Some are sold in small pots for other nurseries to grow on as hedging plants, or others for use of rootstock to graft Chamaecyparis and other like genre. The nurseryman would have to be blind to never notice a variegated mutation, and naturally one has to urge to propagate the colorful stems. Numerous cultivars have been introduced over the years, from the promiscuous smaragd such as Thuja occidentalis, Janed Gold, Phillips Magic Moment, Smaragd Whitmont, Starstruck, Smaragd Variegated, and probably dozens more. In the RHS Encyclopedia, the Smaragd Variegated is described as a slim pillar-shaped plant with mid-green leaves that are cream variegated at the tips. Listed by Kenwith Nursery, UK, in 2003. Unaware of the latter listing, I too introduced a Smaragd Variegated in about 2015 that is slightly different than the European form, but I regret releasing mine into the trade with a name already taken. What to do now? Probably I should discontinue my version, or at least call it something else. But the mix-up has already occurred, and sorry about that. The late Otto Solberger of North Plains, Oregon was a Christmas tree farmer, but atop his remote mountain, he also housed a world-class conifer arboretum. I never met the man, but I befriended his widow, who was pleased that I, or anyone, had an interest in her husband's pine collection. One tree of interest was a snake-branched form of Pseudotsuga menziesii that was identified as Skyline, and I always assumed that it originated from a nearby Skyline Boulevard in Portland, Oregon's West Hills. I used to drive slowly up and down the road hoping that I could rediscover the mother tree, but never did. Solberger had 3 specimens of Skyline on his property, so I suppose that he or someone else produced the grafts, and I was thrilled that Miss Solberger allowed me to dig one of the trees. I never learned if the original Skyline was of a seedling origin or the result of a branch mutation. To further confound the issue, the foliage of the Skyline is blue-green, like the Rocky Mountain form of Pseudotsuga, but all the natives from western Oregon display green needles. To my knowledge, the Skyline clone had not been distributed beyond Solberger's property, so it was unknown in the trade. Naturally, I changed that by propagating and selling it in the late 1980s, so I hesitantly take credit for its broader introduction. It was further popularized in Van Hoey Smith's Conifers with a photo of a row in Buchholz Nursery field. The brief description says, "This form has an extremely open habit, like that of Picea abies, Viminialis." Indeed it does, and I always think of a Dr. Seuss-like character when I see a tree of Skyline. Again, I admit that none of the introductions mentioned in this blog have led to any commercial success, but they provide personal satisfaction in my quest to understand and appreciate Flora's wonders. If you are a specialty nursery or boutique garden center wanting the rare and exceptional plants your customers love, register as a wholesale customer on buchholznursery.com today.